Tonight on Nation to Nation, Senator Kim Pate slams the Conservatives' approach to getting tough on crime.
The evidence is there. Longer, more punitive sentences and putting more and more people in jail does not make the community safer, and in fact it disproportionately impacts Indigenous women.
Métis National Council President Cassidy Caron says there is no data on Métis students across the country.
Even just simple disaggregated data about how many Métis students are within each school. Right now it's based on self-identification. We know that self-identification of Métis students is a challenge.
Ani, welcome to Nation. I'm Annette Francis. The criminal justice system has been a hot topic of discussion on Parliament Hill. A week ago, Conservative MP Frank Caputo tabled Bill C-313, a private member's bill targeting stricter bail reform. The Conservatives say the Liberals' soft-on-crime laws are causing harm to communities, but on the flip side, Senator Kim Pate's Bill S-212 in the Senate is calling for automatic pardons. Joining us now is Senator Kim Pate. Welcome, Senator Pate.
Thank you very much, Annette. I'm pleased to join you from the shores of the Kitchissippi, the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe.
So you've introduced two bills that are calling for updates to mandatory minimum sentences and automatic pardons. Why are these measures needed?
So the pardons provision is Bill S-212. And what it would do is allow convictions to expire instead of people having to apply for pardons. And when we're talking about Indigenous people in particular, very few of them get pardons, in part because there's a cost and in part because the process can be very complicated. And it requires people to actually go and collect all their records and then send them in and then make sure the process is followed up. Very recently, the government did reduce the fee from, it was getting close to $700, but that's just to get the application in. It doesn't count all of the other costs of getting all of the records and collecting them. They did reduce that to $50, and that's great, but the application process is still a problem. We also reduced the wait times back to what they were originally. Under the Harper government, the wait times to get a conviction expiry or a record suspension or a pardon, those are all names that are used, was increased. It was doubled from to 5 years for summary conviction offenses. So these are more minor offenses where people aren't fingerprinted necessarily, to 10 years for more serious offenses. And then there are no pardons at all, so some sexual offenses. So we thought it was important the government came in on an agenda back in 2015 saying that they would do this. There was a bill tabled by Minister Blair when he was Minister of Public Safety, Bill C-31. This will do very similar to that, except the only other thing is it makes it automatic.
Okay. There's talk of bail reform, of course, that came out of the murder of an OPP constable by someone who was granted bail because a judge took into account Indigenous heritage. Could this one incident set back work on lowering the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in jails and prisons?
I feel very strongly that this is not the time to be making this kind of bail reform. It seems to be a knee-jerk response. And to say that this individual was released merely because he was Indigenous and Section 718(2)(e) of the Criminal Code was used, I think it misses the whole point that even when that is taken into account, the first priority that a judge looks at is public safety. And so if in fact people are saying folks are being released where they should be kept in, then that's an argument that really is not about 718(2)(e) and not about indigeneity. And from my perspective, it just reeks of, some of the racist attitudes that happen and the excuses that sometimes are used for reform. What's at the root of some of this and some of the calls, I think, is the fact that for years and years, serious violence hasn't been taken seriously, and particularly when it's violence against women and children. We know that from the TRC, from the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry. So to now use this example, and it's horrible. This is in no way saying any of us would condone someone being killed, a police officer or anyone. But to use this one example as a reason to change the entire bail system when all the pushes have been the other way for years, that the jails are full of people who are awaiting trial, who are essentially there because they have no place to live, and are there predominantly because of all kinds of other issues, and that if we had supports in the community, well, one, they may not be there in the first place, but certainly they could be released awaiting trial. And so many of us are extremely concerned that we're going to see a knee-jerk response, and that the legislation that's been introduced will just, it's a private bill, Bill C 313, that has been introduced by one of the members of Parliament. And I think it's ill-conceived.
Mm-hmm. The Conservative Party is targeting the Liberal government as being soft on crime. How concerned are you that a possible Conservative government could undo a lot of your own work over the past few years?
Well, I think the work is, the Liberal government itself hasn't gone as far as they said they would for fear of being called soft on crime. And we know where the previous Conservative government went, and that was way over. I mean, that's where all these, where the wait times for records, where more mandatory minimum penalties were brought in, where harsher, more punitive sentences were brought in, less access to conditional release or parole into the community, less supports for Indigenous communities. So I think that the prospect is horrific if we face, right now we need to encourage the NDP and the Liberals to actually, and the Bloc as well, all of them to step up and take stronger positions on this, because they know the evidence. The evidence is there. Longer, more punitive sentences and putting more and more people in jail does not make the community safer. And in fact, it disproportionately impacts Indigenous women. And so nobody would say, I don't think anybody would say in the public, whether they're Indigenous or not, that locking up more and more Indigenous women and seizing their kids and throwing them into the child welfare system is somehow going to make Canada safer. Yet that will be the result. That has been the result, and it will continue to be the result if we don't roll this back. So, it's not about me. It's about what we're going to be impacting, who we're going to be impacting most profoundly. And heaven knows that from the calls to action of the TRC and the calls for justice of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and the fact that there's still so little action that has been taken on so many of those pushes, tells us that I think we have to act, and we have to push those who are arguing that they're going to be progressive on this to actually do the right thing.
How confident are you that Bill S-212 will make it through?
Well, that's a good question. I'm before the legal committee today to try and convince my colleagues. If it gets through the Senate, we finish second reading, it'll go through the committee and then go back hopefully for third reading. Then it has to go to the House of Commons, and we have no idea. We know that the previous minister, Minister Blair, and this minister, actually Minister Mendicino, have both said that they want to see improvement in the record process and recognize that there are problems. So my hope is that if they want to change something, or they like most of it, that they'll take it and push it forward. And if they suddenly decide they want to implement their own and it's better than what I'm proposing, I'll be the first one to get behind them.
Okay. On a lighter note, you joined TikTok back in 2021. You now have close to 100,000 followers. Why did you decide to join, and how is the platform working out for you?
Well, I decided to join because my daughter said, who's now at UVic in the Indigenous law program, and go Val Napoleon, the dean there, and everybody else, they're doing a fantastic job. But she said, it's where youth are. You say you want to engage with youth, and if you want to, then they're not on Facebook. That's for you old folks. And she's kinder than that. She didn't call me old folk, but I call myself an old folk. And so she said, you really have to get on this platform. And my response was, I didn't know anything about it, but except that I thought it was just singing and dancing and reels and things, and I didn't even know what that was. And so I said, as long as we can do something substantive, that, it'll be the issues that I'm working on and issues that people are concerned about. And so, to her credit, and Maggie, who is the brains of all the technical part of it, we started doing it. And we've had a few hiatuses because Rodney, my dog, okay, this was one moment where I thought, okay, I'm not sure I'm going to continue with this, because all of a sudden the biggest following was for my dog. And sadly, Rodney died in October. So people were saying, where's Rodney? And I thought, oh, I can't really, I don't want to talk about my dog dying on TikTok. And so then I just, we started doing some new ones, and I went out to visit my daughter, and she got me doing some, and really encouraged me to take on, in fact, what Pierre Poilievre was doing around, the misinformation he was putting out. And she said, next to him, you have the next biggest following of any of the political folks. And so you have a responsibility. And whenever someone says that, you have a responsibility to do something, it's hard not to bite. And so we've been doing that. And now some of the law students are trying to help me with it. But I must confess, it was that younger cohort who knew exactly how to set it up and get me to talk. Now we've been made fun of on CBC. That was kind of hilarious, I thought. And I said, apparently they said my language was too complex. And so I thought, here I thought I was, describing things. So I'll have to figure out how to communicate better and just keep improving.
Wow. Congrats on that. And condolences to losing your dog. And miigwech for joining us.
Oh, thank you very much. Miigwech you, and thank you for all the work you do. I mean, APTN is keeping alive all of these issues in a way that I am, and so many people are grateful for. So thank you.
Right after the break, what's working or not for Métis education? Welcome back. Graduation rates of Indigenous people have always been historically low, and dropout rates high when compared to non-Indigenous students. On Wednesday evening, a parliamentary committee started studying this issue. In attendance as witnesses were Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami President Natan Obed and Métis National Council President Cassidy Caron. Here's a bit of what she had to say.
Research shows that Métis people tend to have lower educational attainment than non-Indigenous Canadians, with higher rates of high school dropout and lower rates of post-secondary graduation.
President Caron joins us now. Welcome.
Hi there. Thank you for having me.
So also in your opening statement, you told the committee that Métis control of Métis education remains an elusive goal. Why is that?
So right now, of course, many people know that education is under provincial jurisdiction. The relationship that the Métis Nation has right now is with Canada as at the federal level. And so the work that we are doing in education right now is strained with the relationships that we do have with the provinces. The work that our Métis governments are wanting to do within each of the provinces throughout the Métis Nation homeland is slightly challenged by the provincial control over the education system.
You also said there's no data on Métis students. Can you explain why? Like, what kind of data do you need?
So even just simple disaggregated data about how many Métis students are within each school. Right now, it's based on self-identification. We know that self-identification of Métis students is a challenge. One is that, self-identification can be done just by checking a box. We don't know for sure if that's a verifiably, registered Métis citizen with our governments. As well, we might be missing some of the students because parents or guardians tend to not want to self-identify their students with their children within those classrooms because of stigmatization, or simply because those students would then have to go into pan-Indigenous programs that don't specifically work for Métis students. So there's a number of different barriers to the disaggregated data, and it is a challenge for us to know to get those data and those numbers.
What's it going to take to help Métis children succeed and see themselves represented in the education system?
So there's a lot that actually can be done within this area without actually having to go in and control the provincial educational systems. Our Métis governments are ready to do this work to be able to, develop and implement Métis-specific education programs. We have education experts throughout the Métis Nation homeland who want to be able to develop these programs and implement them even throughout our own educational institutions. The development of educational infrastructure, the creation of Métis-specific classroom and teaching resources, as well as at-home educational resources for families, all of those pieces can be done through our Métis governments and available for teachers to use within their classrooms if they so choose. Furthermore, we always are looking for investments into the professional development of Métis educators. That is so incredibly important so that Métis students within the K-12 education system can see themselves reflected within the public education system. That representation matters. For a teacher to know who Métis students are and what that means and why we're so proud to be who we are, that matters to children. And so to be able to support Métis educators within that sense as well are different pieces that we can do to support this.
You also mentioned that Métis specific knowledge or history is lacking from most provincial curriculums. What would you like to see in there?
More engagement from the provinces, from the provincial educational systems with our Métis governments would be a positive step forward. A lot of the provinces are indigenizing their curriculum, and that work needs to be done in collaboration with our Métis governments so that the system is actually tailored to Métis students. And right now that engagement is really low from the provinces. And I think that's one of those really simple and positive steps that could be taken.
Just to change the topic a little bit, another of your concerns has been the lack of recognition of Métis survivors of the residential schools. Most of all, how many Métis attended these schools?
So that number, we don't actually have a firm number on. And a large part of that is due to the lack of conversation around Métis going to residential schools. A lot of the schools that our people went to were not recognized under that list in the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. And so there's a lot of different institutions that served the same purpose that our students went to. One of those schools being the Isle La Crosse boarding school, residential school, day school. Those students, there was almost 7 generations of Métis children who went to that institution. They have gone unrecognized as survivors of residential school, and we continue to fight for that recognition. We continue to fight to understand their experiences and their stories and be able to gather that data so we can keep advocating for those survivors.
What recognition would you like Métis survivors of the schools get? What would that look like?
So there's not a specific number, say, for compensation that these residential school survivors are advocating for. I've had conversations with residential school survivors who said sometimes it's not even about the money. It's just about the fact that they want to be recognized for having gone through the same trauma that other students went through and were recognized through that Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. They want to know that they are believed, that they are telling the truth, that they went through these horrific experiences as children. And that recognition is so important just to the humanity of these survivors. And so we're continuing to fight for the recognition of a number of those schools, Isle La Crosse Residential School being one of those schools. We're working with the federal government to be able to make sure that they recognize that as a residential school. From there, we'll be working with the Survivors Society in La Crosse to be able to determine what it is exactly they want for compensation. Okay,
we'll leave it there. Miigwech for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Coming up after the break, I'll tell you what's happening on Parliament Hill. Welcome back. before we go, I'd like to highlight a few of the other Parliament Hill events involving Indigenous issues that happened this week. On Wednesday, RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki announced her retirement effective 1 month from now. NDP MP Peter Julian wished Lucki a happy retirement, but made it clear there are still challenges within the RCMP that needs to be addressed.
And the federal government needs to take good care to ensure that the next commissioner that steps up deals with these issues of systemic racism that have been raised around the RCMP. The accountability and the transparency of the RCMP to the Canadian public is something that the next commissioner must deal with. And we have seen, most egregiously, a number of incidences with Indigenous people, a high rate of incarceration among Indigenous peoples. These are issues as well that the next commissioner of the RCMP must deal with.
Thursday morning, Governor General Mary Simon gave a keynote address at a gathering of Inuit educators as a part of the continued celebration of the Decade of Indigenous Languages. For Simon, Inuit education is one she's familiar with and one that's very personal to her.
When I was growing up as a child up in Kuujjuaq, and it used to be called Fort Chimo, I remember the trouble we would be in if we dared to speak our language, Inuktitut, on school grounds. And if we were caught speaking Inuktitut, we were punished for it.
On Thursday afternoon, the NDP brought the crisis of a lack of Indigenous housing to the floor of the House of Commons. Blake Desjardins and Lori Ulut grilled the federal government over it during question period.
Indigenous communities are in dire need of housing. Nunavummiut are living in canvas tents in the winter, sleeping in shifts in overcrowded rooms and waiting years for adequate housing. The government of Nunavut and Nunavut Tungavik together have asked for $500 million over 3 years starting in the upcoming budget. Will this government properly invest in Nunavut housing so Northerners can sleep in safe, comfortable homes?
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable member for an important question. The lack of safe, quality housing across the North is unacceptable, which is why our government is making historic investments in collaboration with partners. Our government has been clear we will not impose solutions on Northerners. Instead, we will work with them to support their priorities. Through Northern Affairs alone, we are investing $200 million, Mr. Speaker, to support housing and related infrastructure in the North. This flexible funding allows territorial partners to continue to advance their most pressing housing needs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Edmonton Griesbach.
Mr. Speaker, that answer wasn't the one expected by the member of Nunavut. The member of Nunavut asked for $500 million. 200 is not even close. And in my writing, it's no better. It's Edmonton Griesbach's worst problem. We have Indigenous people who are living on the streets, who are enduring the housing crisis, let down by this Prime Minister and let down by the Premier of Alberta.
That's it for tonight's episode of Nation to Nation. If you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcast at aptnnews.ca/podcast. Miigwech and have a good night.